As we begin, I'm going to do a little bit of a review of where we've been the last 3 weeks and what we're going to do tonight. There are 2 slides to this PowerPoint. So this is the topic for these 4 weeks of the Quest class, major themes in the writings of C.S. Lewis. And just to remind you where we've been, first hour of the first week, we talked about desire, longing, Sehnsucht, the most important concept in the writings of C.S. Lewis. And by the way, just for those of you, maybe somebody's tuning in for the first time and didn't tune into any of the others. My name is Joel Heck. I'm the lecturer, the Lewis guy that's talking these 4 weeks of the Quest courses. And thank you for tuning in if you're seeing this lecture live online or you're checking in later on. Thank you for supporting us by being here. So I appreciate your presence. And C.S. Lewis, a favorite topic, the most frequently quoted Christian author of the 20th century, probably even to this day, at least among Christian pastors and the like. I always get excited whenever we read a devotional like Our Daily Bread or hear one of my pastors cite C.S. Lewis, and I think, yes, and I didn't even plant that quotation with them. But anyway, Lewis's primary central concept that brought him to faith and then he sought to explain to others is that concept of desire, longing, the German word Sehnsucht. Talked in the second hour about the unwelcome diagnosis and good dreams. The unwelcome diagnosis is the bad news that we fall short of God's standard. Good dreams is one of the ways in which God has prepared the world for the gospel and giving them glimpses of glory, kind of like the disciples got an amount of transfiguration when they saw Jesus in his full glory. Second week, we talked about story, the power and the impact of storytelling, and every preacher knows about the value of a good story, and I'm learning, sort of relearning that again and again. As I write devotions, especially trying to tell stories, and I've got a story about Festo Kavingere. Anybody ever heard that name? An African evangelist from the 70s and 80s. So came to faith in Christ through a traveling evangelist. Anyway, became a bishop in the Church of England. So I'm telling his story in the devotion that will go out next Monday or Tuesday. And then now these don't necessarily all fit together. The first 3, I think, relate very much to the missionary task of the church. But we talked about grief. And we'll get into that a little bit tonight in the second hour as we talk about Shadowlands. But grief, especially focusing on Lewis's heartbreaking little book, A Grief Observed, his recollections of his emotional state in the months after his wife's death. Temptation, that was the session on the Screw Tape Letters, all about temptation. I tried to put these as briefly as possible. Mere Christianity, what is the essential core of the Christian faith that virtually all Christians agree on. So Screw Tape Letters and Mere Christianity, 2 of the top 3 most popular works of Lewis, and Mere Christianity being the most influential of Lewis's books. Tonight we're going to talk about the Tao, which is a Chinese word that means the way. It's Lewis's equivalent term for the way in which the world operates and the way that God has made us to be. It's basically what Lewis calls an objective standard of right and wrong, objective values or virtues. And then in the last hour, Shadowlands, which is the story of Lewis's meeting Joy Davidman, first through exchanging letters and then face-to-face, eventually marrying her, and then dealing with the tragedy of her death that was the springboard for that book, A Grief Observed, this item number 4. So that's where we've been, that's where we're going tonight, and I'm just going to put this PowerPoint away, and there's Festo Kavingere, by the way, died in 1988, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Well, you have to read the devotion, I guess, if you get our weekly newsletter. So we are, okay, there we go. Okay, first hour on Lewis's Abolition of Man, book published in 1944 based on 3 lectures he gave at the University of St. Andrews in 1943. So this is a doodle that was put up online and taken down due to copyright violations, but it's a way of trying to express in pictorial form what Lewis had to say in The Abolition of Man. But that's not all that helpful. I'll try not to go to explain that diagram. But this is the title of the book that Lewis wrote. I subtitled this C.S. Lewis on Objective Values. That's not how Lewis subtitled it, but nevertheless, on the right-hand side, we see the cover of the book that was reprinted just a few years ago, along with a companion volume by Michael Ward that I will describe a little bit later on. Excellent book that's, I guess you could call it a commentary on The Abolition of Man. So if you've ever tried reading The Abolition of Man, I think you'll probably find the first hour tonight helpful to better understand it, and secondly, maybe you'll be able to make sense out of it and even explain it to others. The significance of the book, it is the GOAT. That's not a bad word, that's the good news, as you all know, the greatest of all time. It's been described as the best defense of an objective standard of right and wrong in the English language, best ever written. So it could be called Lewis's greatest of all time, and most of you have never read it. It's philosophical, it's dense and deep, and it's not easy, and that's one of the reasons why I teamed up with two other writers, one a professional philosopher at the University of Texas who really knows his stuff, and another a classical education secondary school teacher in Phoenix, Arizona. So the three of us got together to write an article about how to teach this difficult book, and we discovered very quickly that one of the most important things about teaching it is to know what its message is, and that's a difficult thing to accomplish. So I hope we help people along the way with the article that we wrote. So GOAT, greatest of all time, number one. Number two, Michael Jordan, at least in terms of basketball prowess. I think still more people say Michael Jordan than anyone else. And yeah, the greatest athlete ever. There are a few people there. There's Kobe Bryant in the back, Serena Williams. There's Simone Biles in the lower left corner, and Tom Brady, of course, in the middle, who's now become a broadcaster, apparently, in a second career after NFL sports. I mean, won more Super Bowl titles than any other quarterback in history. So just a few things about abolition, my shorthand for Abolition of Man. So Oxford philosopher John Lucas calls it a powerful argument reminiscent of Plato, Pascal, and Dostoevsky, and worth elaborating afresh in each generation, which is why I'm doing it. Joseph Ratzinger, future Pope Benedict, talks about keen accuracy. Writer Alan Jacobs used to be at Wheaton College, then was at, I think, Baylor University. I'm not sure where he is now, but the most profound of Lewis's cultural critiques, so you could call it cultural criticism, I suppose. Mary Midgley, first rate, clear, balanced answer to current mistakes. This is a book that really speaks to our current situation in Canada. Hans Urs von Balthasar called it taught brilliance. English professor Tony Nuttall calls it dazzling, and thoroughly routes whole volumes of Nietzsche and Sartre, if those names make any sense to you whatsoever. Nietzsche, the God is dead, German theologian, or philosopher is better, because if he thinks God is dead, he can hardly be a theologian, right? But so Tony thought that this book really replaces or refutes Nietzsche and Sartre. I heard a story or read somewhere that Sartre became a Christian on his deathbed. Anybody ever hear that? I don't know if that's true or not, but there are stories like that that are almost urban legends, so I don't know whether to believe it or not. So I told you about Michael Ward. His companion volume to The Abolition of Man is called After Humanity. See the subtitle there, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And if you remember from an earlier slide, there was a waterfall with a guy silhouetted in front of the waterfall. And the waterfall is there on the cover because of a memorable word picture that Lewis writes about early on in The Abolition of Man. We'll spend some time talking about that that waterfall and the significance of it, and how Lewis critiqued a couple of secondary English professors, one from Australia and I think one from the UK. However, the Abolition of Man is still difficult to understand, even for those of us that have read it multiple times. It's difficult to teach. Perhaps I'll be able to explain it tonight, perhaps not. And if not, well, this is the last class, so you be the judge. If you decide to read the book or reread it, in Derek's case, then perhaps my efforts have succeeded. And if all you take from it is this PowerPoint, this lecture, this introduction to the Abolition of Man, I think your lives will be, I don't want to say bettered or ennobled, but you'll see certain things more clearly than you did previously, I believe. So we're going to do an exercise, and you can do this in your head. There are going to be 6 statements I'm going to ask you to respond to in 1 or 2 categories. You can write this down, or you can just remember it well. So there are going to be 6 items from a book called The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis, on science, scientism, and society. So we got 6 statements. Mozart was born in Salzburg. Mozart wrote beautiful music. John Paul II was Pope for over 20 years. John Paul II was a good Pope. Bell-bottoms were popular in the 1970s. Bell-bottoms are strange.
No, it's not cool. It says cool on our paper.
Oh, it does, yeah.
Well,
Well,
they may be strange, but they were cool.
yeah.
That's right.
In this exercise, there's no difference between being strange and being cool, actually. So the people that think, some people think they're cool and other people know they're strange, but they're both referring to the same thing. Well, okay, so tell me whether, okay, don't talk to me. You can just, in your mind's eye, determine which is a fact and which is an opinion. Reread them, think about them. If I were to assign an F or an O to each one of them, which ones would I call fact? Which ones would I call opinion? Would I make them all facts, all opinions, a mix thereof? Okay. I don't want to rush you, but okay. So you ready? So the exercise, here are the answers. And typically I do this with my college students years ago, and they would say 1, 3, and 5 are facts, 2, 4, and 6 are opinions. But what Lewis is getting at is that there are some parts of life that fit into, let's say, the aesthetic field, like music, that are objectively beautiful, stunningly powerful compositions, and probably few people except maybe Bach could match Mozart in terms of his ability to compose a piece of music that kind of soared up to the heavens. But so Lewis is arguing in this book that some things are obviously facts, some things are not so obviously facts, but are still actual truths and not just opinions. But a lot of our philosophers and scientists have, including Kant and Hume, if those names ring a bell to anybody, have convinced the world that there are all kinds of truths are in 2 different areas. There are scientific truths that we know for as to be facts, but everything else that's not in that category is an opinion. They put aesthetic statements, they put philosophical statements, they put theological statements, personal faith. Those are just opinions that might be more true or not, could be true for you and not true for me, and have relegated much religious thinking and even Christian conviction to the level of opinion. Well, take it or leave it. There's no significant truth about whether you believe in Christ as your Savior or not. So they are all facts. Michael Eschliman, in one of his books, says modern scientific doctrine holds all facts to be objective and all value to be subjective. And Lewis is tackling that second position, that values are just subjective and not really grounded in truth. So, Mozart music is beautiful, whether we happen to like it or not. I mean, you might like classical music, you might like Mozart's music, and so you would agree with that readily. You might not like it, but it is beautiful, whether you like that style of music or not. John Paul II was indeed a good pope, whether you're a Catholic or not.
So who determined that to be a fact?
Who determined that to be a fact? Well, for example, one thing I did was to take a survey of our music faculty at Concordia University, Texas, and I asked them this question: is music a really well done piece of music? Is that objectively beautiful, an objectively strong composition or not? And if so, what are some of the criteria that you would set up that would be criteria by which you judge a piece of music as being good or bad? And they gave me a bunch of them: harmony, resolution of tones, major versus minor key. And I'm married to a musician, so I probably ought not to say too much about this because she knows more about music in her little finger than I do in my whole body. But at any rate, that's one example of how I address that. And I'm not an expert on Catholic popes, but some people give him credit for being the major reason why the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union dissolved. Electing a Polish individual whose country was subject to very much of communistic ideology as the Pope sent some shockwaves through the world and helped to bring down that wall. At least some would say that. I'm not a historian in that regard. Yeah, and no matter what you think, bell bottoms are not cool. They're strange. Some like them. I used to wear bell bottoms. I won't ask. You did? Okay. So I'll confess one of my many sins. But the summary of this exercise, all the odd-numbered statements are more obviously facts about beauty and goodness, but all the even-numbered statements are also objectively true. Three things that are really under attack in the world today are goodness, truth, and beauty. And those are the three virtues of the liberal arts that many Christian colleges especially hold up as valid and worthy of our study. So goodness has to do with ethics, what's right and what's wrong. Is something objectively wrong or not? We have a lot of people unable to say that a particular crime that somebody committed is really objectively wrong. Truth, we have a lot of people saying, what's true for you isn't true for me. That people aren't sure what is true or what's not. And in terms of beauty, aesthetics, the same thing is the case. So I told you about this earlier. Modern secularists view all statements in one of two categories. Statements in the realms of science and mathematics are objectively true, they say and argue, and a lot of that's true, except that a lot of things that people say about science. There was this one health expert in the States who claimed, I am science, and yet some of the things that he foisted upon the US population turned out to be false. I mean, in one instance he said masks don't do any good, and then he said they do good, and then they admitted later on they don't do any good, and he called himself science. So science is objective, scientists are not. Put it that way. So secondly, other statements in the realm of aesthetics, philosophy, ethics, and religion are matters of opinion, neither true or false. They're just opinions, but they're not grounded in facts, according to Kant and Hume and many others who have bought into this. So I would argue, And I think most musicians, well-trained musicians, would argue even a statement about Mozart's music can be objectively true. And it's also the case that, yes, some people like his music and some don't, but there are a lot of reasons for that as well. It's just that it's a little bit harder to pin down something like a musical composition. Likewise, a statement about the resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection can be objectively true. Or would you say, well, it might be true for you, Joel Heck, but it's not true for me. I'm not, at least I don't think this crowd would go there. So your thoughts before we go any further. We'll get into Lewis's argument, the abolition of man. And maybe the most important thing for you to do in response to what I'm presenting somewhat briefly and superficially is to read that book. So let's get into the background of the book, alternate title, Reflections on Education with Special Reference to the Teaching of English in the Upper Forms of School. That's the subtitle of the book. Not exactly concise and catchy, but in 1943, publishers weren't too concerned about that. And already by that time, Lewis he had quite a reputation as a writer. And so just to have his name on the cover of the book was going to assure its success. So he's writing about education. He's writing about these two school teachers that have written a book on teaching English. So written in 1943 as the Riddle Memorial Lectures, delivered those 3 evenings at the University of Durham, published the next year by Oxford University Press, and rated 7th most important work of nonfiction in the past century in a 2013 National Review poll, which is a Christian organization. They put Winston Churchill number 1, Mere Christianity number 26, so Abolition of Man number 7 in that poll. And I'm sure you can find polls that don't list it at all, but that's that's a reputable source. So the book that Lewis had read, been sent a review copy by a publisher, he called the Green Book because he didn't want to call out specific authors by name. And he gave the 2 authors the names Gaius and Titius. However, it didn't take long to figure out that the book was The Control of Language, published in 1939. So he's giving these lectures in 43. The authors were Alec King and Martin Ketley, 2 English schoolmasters teaching in Australia. And yes, its cover was green, so he called it the Green Book. In fact, this is Lewis's copy, kept at the Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois. And so you see the title of the book and the authors right there. So 3 lectures on 3 successive evenings at the University of Durham. And part 1 is called Men Without Chests. And he uses the word chest instead of heart because the latter could easily be confused with emotionalism. He didn't want to say that. So men without a heart, without what he would also call trained emotions. It's a lament. He's sad about the direction that thinking and writing is going in the world at that time. Michael Ward, I think it's Michael Ward calls it the checkup. To take inventory on where the world is today, how people are thinking and communicating. Part 2, this is still part 1. He speaks out here against the subjectivist, the problem with thinking that all values are subjective. So this is a negative chapter. If everything is subjective, then we have no solid foundation as Christians to stand on. Part 2, the way. The Tao is the word he uses. It's a challenge. It's a diagnosis. How can we address this problem? He speaks out against the innovator here, the inconsistency of stepping outside the Tao, saying there's really no objective values apart from science and math, and yet still using the Tao, the way. That's what Tao means is the way, as a criterion on which to criticize somebody's opinions or even somebody's aesthetic values. And so he is suggesting the need to integrate the head with the belly. He says, by our intellects we are pure spirit, by our bellies we are pure animal, but it's the chest. Remember, men without chest, it's the chest that integrates our intellect and our passions. Talked about that in a week on story, how intellect of itself knows a lot of information but doesn't know what to do with it. The emotions provide some impetus, but by themselves they're all over the place. So the two coming together can be effective partners in communicating, and Lewis's all of his writings are, virtually all of his writings are examples of that. So this is the positive chapter. If we can begin to see that some of the things that we have tossed aside as somebody's mere opinion, not that there are no opinions, but too easily the secular world casts aside values that Christians hold dear as just their opinion, not worth the paper they're written on. Part 3 is called The Abolition of Man, same title as the book. What happens, the implications of a purely subjectivist point of view. And he's writing here not against the subjectivist, part 1, or the innovator, part 2, but against the condition or the problem with elevating subjective values and losing trained emotions. Above the Tao is that we ruin ourselves. The will to power is encouraged. Our own values are just as easily rejected by others if they come to power. And so now you either have people making decisions on the basis of pure whim. I think I'll eat French fries instead of baked potatoes. I mean, I guess that's a whim that can be okay. But when a person who operates with very subjective values gets in power, have you ever noticed in, I don't know how much it's true of Canada because I don't know Canada nearly as well as I know the States, but so often people get into positions of power and they no longer are tolerant of other people's values, convictions, beliefs. And they take steps to force you to agree with them. And like I like to say, this is sort of an application of the problem of sin. There is a totalitarian in every one of us. Because I think if I got into a position of absolute power, if I held the ring of power, this is not the ring of power, but if I had the ring of power that Gollum so desperately desired to have, I could force everybody to, eat peanut butter sandwiches or whatever you wanted, whatever you happen to like. Listen to Bach 3 hours a day, every day. I could, when you're in that position of power, then to be able to force your viewpoint on other people there aren't objective standards of right and wrong on which to base your decisions. You're there in power, so you get to do what you want to do. And that's part of the problem the world is facing today. So once again, the 3 parts: men without chests. Lewis deals with the problem with thinking that all values are subjective. Of course, it's a two-way street here. If I think that your values are subjective, you can just as easily think my values are subjective, and that I have no right to say that your values are subjective, nor do you have any right to say that of me, and therefore we kind of descend into drivel and don't say much about anything anymore. The way, the inconsistency in stepping outside the Tao, discarding traditional values. Seems like there are lots of attempts to discard traditional values there. I read, must be right because I think I read it in Wikipedia, that there have been 2 attempts in the last 500 years to change from a 7-day week. One in France and one in Russia. One went to 5-day week and one went to a 10-day week. a way of undermining the creation week, the way it happened in the beginning, and the way in which there is a rhythm by which we live year after year. And both societies gave it up as too confusing, impossible to implement. And so I guess they weren't able to entirely step outside of the Tao in that regard. But that's the way God made us. That's part of the magic that God put into this universe before the beginning of time. And so integrating the head with the belly, allowing our head, which understands objective truths, to train our hearts to love the things that we ought to love, to fear the things that we ought to fear, to show courage in circumstances that are appropriate to that, and to demonstrate loyalty even when the odds are stacked against you. If you read the Chronicles of Narnia as an exercise in Lewis attempting for children to inculcate the kinds of values that are objectively true. You'll see story after story, like where Diggory says, Mom was awfully strict about keeping your promises, and the White Witch is trying to talk him into eating the apple in that garden and not taking it back to Aslan. And he stands true with the value of keeping your promises. You say you're going to do something, you do it. And he did it. And he finds out later on that, had he taken the apple back to his mother, she would have gotten well, but you would have really suffered greater anguish in the subsequent years had you done that. But it would have worked for a while. But the fact that he brought the apple back to Aslan, well, I don't want to go into Narnia and tell the whole story, but the truth is that there's a lot of strong, excellent philosophy in the Chronicles of Narnia. In fact, I probably mentioned this book at some point in the past, that Philosophy in the Chronicles of Narnia is an excellent book written by about 36 professional philosophers, each of which takes an issue represented in one or more of the Chronicles of Narnia and writes a philosopher's summary and evaluation of what Lewis has to say about that particular topic. Really excellent book. And I wish I could recall, ever have this wish that I could recall 90% of what I read in that book? I'd be thrilled if I could recall 2% of what I read in the book. Anyway, it was enough to make a big impression on me. Well, the abolition of man, then the third part again. The problem with elevating subjective values above the Tao is that we abolish ourselves. We no longer have hearts that are trained to love, fear, trust, be courageous, be bold in those circumstances where we need to be. Will to power, is encouraged, and there's plenty of that going on in our world today. So here's another way of looking at it. Problem with subjectivism, the solution in objectivism. What will happen if we don't solve the problem? Mankind will be abolished. We won't know what's true or not anymore. We won't know whether this medicine is good for us or not. We won't know who to trust, and there's plenty of that already in our world today. This is the third book in the Ransom trilogy. Spent some time on that in the spring. Lewis described that hideous strength as the novelistic embodiment of the abolition of man. So if you want to see how the concepts in the abolition of man play themselves out in one fictional scenario, that hideous strength does that for you. I think it's Monica Hilder, who's a professor of English at Trinity Western, who calls this her favorite Lewis book. And I have to say, it's one of the two books that the first time I read it, I just did not like it. And it grows on you, but I've read it a couple times since, and it's okay. It's a lot better than I give it credit for. But Reese, Daventer Press is coming out with a book next year, and I have to look up the title of the book. I'm reading the book in a pre-publication version of it because they want me to write an endorsement for it. But it's a book that deals with the Ransom trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet. Among other things, being a great story, it defines masculinity in a biblically solid and objective way. Second book, Paralander, is about a trip to Venus, describes or defines femininity in novel form. And then That Hideous Strength describes marriage as it ought to be lived, because the two key characters in that book, there are a bunch of key characters, but there's this young married couple called Mark and Jane Studdock. As the story begins, the first word of the book is marriage, and their marriage is kind of on the rocks. They don't really care all that much for one another, but they've stayed together. Mark's following his career. She's doing her doctoral work on, I think it's John Donne. And anyway, they get caught up in the storyline, and they both become Christians in the midst of the story of That Hideous Strength. And the book ends with their marriage being saved and them coming together again. And I just never looked at that trilogy in that way, reading this book that, I can't remember Reese's last name. Anyway, it's coming out next year, and if anybody really wants to know about the book, I'll look up the title and send you an email at some point down the line. So the title, by the way, of this book comes from a 1555 poem written by David Lindsay, referring to the Tower of Babel, That Hideous Strength. And there's a place in the book, towards the end of the book, where language is confused, kind of like in the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11. All right, so let's get into a bit of the text. So the story of Coleridge at the Waterfall, and I have taken license to actually type into this PowerPoint that story. So Lewis writes, and he's read this book by King and Ketley, Gaius and Titius of King and Ketley. It's the Green Book. It's called The Control of Language, because they think that language confuses and misleads people. And Lewis has started to read. He read half, 2/3 of the book, and then he wrote his lectures, partly motivated by reading this book. In their second chapter, Gaius and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the Waterfall. It's well known in England, but I looked and I read and I tried to find, I read some of Coleridge's incomprehensible literary criticism about poetry, and I finally found it. The story appears in Dorothy Wordsworth's diary of a walking tour through Scotland and the Midlands in England. So, but the name Coleridge made me think, oh, this is something that Coleridge wrote, but it wasn't. So Coleridge at the Waterfall. You remember that there were two tourists present, that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Now this is a waterfall, not like Niagara, where the word sublime, which another synonym for that would be awesome, I guess you could say. And Coleridge thought that sublime was much more appropriate to that waterfall than pretty. So Gaius and Titius comment as follows. When the man said that is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was really, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Here are a good many deep questions settled in pretty summary fashion, but the authors are not yet finished. They add, this confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something important about something, and actually are only saying something about our own feelings. Now Lewis would side with Coleridge and say that that waterfall was undoubtedly an impressive display of God's beauty and power in nature as the water flowed rapidly over the rocks and left one with an impression of something rather awesome. And King and Ketley are saying there's no relationship between the word sublime and that waterfall. It's all in our minds and our emotions. That's what they're saying. So the question is, was the waterfall sublime or pretty? I kind of already told you where I stand. Was Coleridge saying something about the waterfall or about his feelings when he accepted the word sublime but rejected the word pretty? That was probably also pretty or beautiful or lovely in some sort of an aesthetic sense. But the word sublime, he felt, was not a statement about his own feelings, but it was a statement about the waterfall itself, about something out there rather than something in here or in here. So Lewis, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to disagree with Lewis. I told you last week that there are some areas where I disagree with Lewis. Okay, here is one where I think it's wise. So likewise, is Niagara Falls or are Niagara Falls? I mean, there's more than one fall, so it's plural, so shouldn't the verb be are, except that doesn't sound right, does it? Is Niagara Falls, for example, sublime or pretty?
One in Canada is both.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's beauty, just like the waterfall that Coleridge saw, but I would argue that sublime is even more appropriate. So, Dorothy Wordsworth, Recollections of a Tour in Scotland, AD 1803. And the river is the River Clyde in Lanarkshire. So the emotions we get from an impressive waterfall, standing, looking out over the Canadian Falls, those U.S. falls are kind of, they're not sublime feelings, Lewis argues, but feelings of veneration or humility. That is, they're correlates. They are correlatives, almost opposites. So this is me trying to apply Lewis's concept to another couple of situations. You won't have cute feelings while looking at something cute, and you won't have tall or proud feelings standing next to a 7-foot center for the Boston Celtics. Yeah, they do say Celtics. I hear it's the only place in the world where that word is pronounced with a soft C instead of Celtic. So Lewis says, yes, saying this is sublime leads to, I have humble feelings. That's what Lewis says, not sublime feelings. It's not a statement of my emotional status, because if I looked at my status next to this thundering falls with mist rising up and maybe the bait of the mist going underneath the falls or close to the falls, that is so impressive. Impressive enough to impress us when we hear about somebody going over the falls in a barrel and living to tell the story about it. So maybe you can think of another example where an experience leads to an opposite or correlative of that experience.
The sunrise this morning.
Okay, the sunrise this morning. It was beautiful. I think objectively beautiful. It looked like the sky was on fire kind of at a certain time just before sunrise. And what feelings do we have at a beautiful sunrise? I don't think I have beautiful feelings. I mean, I think I have a certain sense of awe at the artist that, if I can use the word, created that visual. And again, humbled by the vastness of beauty and beauty of nature. This, by the way, is the falls, and I decided to hold this off until a little bit later. We're 200 years later, 221 years after that walking tour. So maybe that doesn't look nearly as impressive as it did back then, but it's a little hard to see what a person would look like to scale. This is, I think the main fall off here from here to here is probably, I don't know, maybe to my waist or my shoulder. So it's not huge like some of the tall falls, Niagara, and then in South. What's the famous one in Brazil, right? Iguazu Falls. Now, I should have a picture of that up here if you want to see a real waterfall.
Well, maybe they never saw any other, and that was big.
Yeah. And they lived in the UK. They probably never left the UK, and so
Never saw the other
this is the best they can do in the UK.
one. Smart.
Okay. So Lewis says, following King and Ketley, you come to other absurdities. He says, you are contemptible means I have contemptible feelings. When they're either just or unjust feelings. I mean, if you are really doing something contemptible, then my feeling about that would be just. If I'm claiming you're contemptible and you're not, then that would be unjust. But that can be objectively determined depending on the truth of the story. Your feelings are contemptible, Lewis says, then would mean my feelings are contemptible. Because I have feelings about you and I have contemptible feelings, my feelings are contemptible. So we end up in a number of absurdities like that piece of art that I imagine some modern artist got tens of thousands of dollars for producing, but we won't go there. So 2 Gaius and Titius propositions. All sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And this is from Gaius and Titius. Secondly, all such, I think this is Lewis in The Abolition of Man about them. All such statements are unimportant. And Lewis says the practical results of these propositions is a missed opportunity to teach what makes good writing. Another practical result, Lewis says, is that Gaius and Titius have cut out the student's soul by not explaining to the man of real sensibility how metaphor can help, or to the mere trousered ape that the Atlantic Ocean is more than cold salt water. Trousered ape is a man who has been abolished. So he's a man in form, but he wears pants, but his sense of beauty or vastness or awesomeness or appreciation for the heavens declaring the glory of God, that's lost on him. And maybe one of my favorite examples of this, I borrowed it from somebody else who borrowed it from J.R. Tolkien. Can you read The Lord of the Rings and ever quite look at a tree in the same way before reading that? I mean, these talking, living organisms called the Ents that are able to travel along the ground and tremendous power and strength, and he sort of brought those trees alive. Lewis and Tolkien both loved nature and saw it as God's creation, but a tree is just a bunch of wood with a few leaves on it that's good for making houses and building chairs, and that's, for some, the trousered ape, that's all a tree is, but for others, the forests of northern Alberta are tremendous places to go camping, to go hunting. There's a lot of beauty there. And I'm probably going to stop at, I have my alarm set here so I don't go too far, 7:49. I'm going to cut it off at 7:55, whether I'm done with this part. Well, I guess got 7 slides yet. So part 2, Micah Watson, a philosopher, I think from Calvin College, says the way is an extended meditation on the truth of the first principle of practical reason. That principle is to do good and avoid evil. Man's conquest of nature, such as work on the human genome or the coronavirus, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of power on man's side. That's my words in brackets there. Lewis's are the others. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well, with government insistence that you not leave your home, that you must wear a mask, that you must do this, that, and the other thing. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. In every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he is also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. And more the power is centered in just a few. The result, totalitarianism, a select few imposing their values on everyone else. Social media has become a force that allows some gatekeepers to call the viewpoints of others misinformation or disinformation. This is really an attack on freedom of speech, both in Canada and the US. Too often that which has been labeled misinformation turns out to be right, because they don't want the other point of view to be heard, so it's a violation of the right to free speech. Probably some other instances we could cite, but I realize this is being recorded, and I don't want the Prime Minister to watch. Well, actually, it'd be a good thing if he might help straighten him out a little bit. So remember when the coronavirus vaccine was rated as more than 90% effective? Hitherto, the plans of educationalists have achieved very little of what they attempted. That is what Lewis calls the conditioners use education to shape the individual into what a few key people want them to be. And who largely controls the schools in Canada today? The mind molders on the new age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state. It's like he's writing this in 1943, is he? Or is he writing this last year in Toronto, Canada? Have you noticed that the media is overwhelmingly of one mind today? I think from what I hear from talking to some Canadians, they don't realize that the media is overwhelmingly left-leaning, and they think that what they're getting is balanced news reporting, and they're not. I mean, sometimes they are. It's good to criticize the past, but we also need to let the past criticize us. Lewis knew that people in each historical period have prejudices of which they are unaware. For example, if we should tear down statues because of the sins of those people who are recognized by the statues, what statues should remain? Who has such a personal record that they can't be criticized? Well, okay, this is second last slide. This is just a review of this. If values are objective, then beauty is not just someone's opinion. The statements of religious belief are not just a leap of faith, but based on sound historical events that have been verified. Opinions can conform to the way the world and people are, or they can be entirely false. A person can react correctly to danger, bereavement, beauty, love, and many other abstract ideas. And I talked about the Chronicles of Narnia. Standards of goodness, truth, and beauty are objectively true. I talked to my art professor friend back in Austin, Texas, and he had criteria for beautiful art as well as beautiful, my musicians for beautiful music. So if subjective is true, then anything can be true. Then the New York Times writer can make up stories, earn honors for writing, even a Pulitzer Prize, I think, and people will believe him. And a student who doesn't like a grade can accuse a professor of sexual assault and be believed, and a person can accuse a company or a wealthy person of racism and win a large financial settlement. Anyway, that's the end of my introduction to The Abolition of Man. I commend the book to you. And before we go any further, I have a few of these items if you want. Inklings Institute of Canada event. Monica Hilder, I believe, is a member of the LCC, teaches at Trinity Western. She's going to have a free online lecture on a week from Thursday, C.S. Lewis and John Lennox on the Technocratic Surveillance Society. How should we then live? If you want to take one of these, you can. This is the color one, and this is black and white. And likewise, if you would like a shot at winning my daughter's and my children's story, The Lion That Roared, all you got to do is put your name on one of these pieces of paper, fold it once, and put it in here, and then I'll blindly, or maybe Cheryl will I'm not going to put my name in, she won't either, blindly pick one out of there and give that book to that winner. And if you could care less whether you win that book or not, then you don't have to participate. So let's take a break, shall we? are vying for the right.
He just wants a bonus chance. No, I saw it.
My name in there for your too.
Okay, I guess we're all back. So I'm not going to show any favorites. I'm not even going to look. I'm just going to mix them around and pick one piece of paper, and it is
Erica.
Erica. There we go, Erica. Congratulations. You play your cards right. One of the two authors might even sign it for you.
Wow.
And actually, the other one is going to be in Edmonton in March. She's a kind of a world-renowned church organist, composer, arranger of music, and the Royal Canadian College of Organists is bringing her to Edmonton to do a recital down at Presbyterian Church downtown on, I think it's a Tuesday night when parking is difficult and nobody comes down. I mean, people don't typically go to organ recitals anyway, but she's going to be here for a few days, and Jennifer Maxfield, I had nothing to do with it other than to answer her questions, and she'll stay with us. But Jennifer got the idea and looked her up online, and so Brenda is my co-author on that. And so let's get into Shadowlands, or a PowerPoint called Jack Joy and Shadowlands, because the term Shadowlands is a term that Jack used to describe to Joy what the world that we live in now can be described as. So let's a little bit about their relationship. This is the first day that Jack got a letter from Joy Davidman. Her maiden name was Davidman, her married name was Gresham, and then she later on is Joy Lewis. And she wrote a really clever, brilliant type of letter that impressed Jack. They meet for the first time at the Eastgate Hotel in Oxford. That's the Eastgate. You can see Eastgate on the wall if you're sitting in the front row. But the lighter colored building on the second floor, that's the Eastgate Hotel. I've had lunch there on one occasion across the street from Magdalen College. In fact, you can see the tower of Magdalen College, Jack's own college. In the background, the far left part of the screen, you can see a few spires. That is actually across the street, and even though it doesn't look like it, because the street curves. So that's where they met. By September 26th, she's staying at the Kilns, which is the name of the house that Jack and Warren purchased. Show that picture of that on the next slide. They met in London. He invites her to spend Christmas at the Kilns with the boys. There's the Kilns. Is the Kilns or are the Kilns? There used to be kilns on the property. So the house is the Kilns, so I guess it is the Kilns. So they spent a couple of weeks at the Kilns, fairly good-sized house. You can go to Oxford and walk through it, get a tour of it. It's been refurbished, reestablished, and it's rather similar to what it was when Jack and Warren were living there. On December 25, you recognize that date, Jack gave Joy a copy of George MacDonald's Diary of an Old Soul. February 1953, she becomes a member of the Episcopal Church, is confirmed in New York at St. John the Divine. November, Joy, Douglas, and David are two sons by way of Bill Gresham, leave during the first week of that month for London, sail to London. Doug celebrates his 8th birthday during the voyage. He settled in London for the next 18 months. December that year, Joy and sons David and Douglas arrive at the Kilns. Jack and Joy really hit it off. She was his intellectual equal, an award-winning poet, an author, former screenwriter in Hollywood, but she didn't like it. April 1954, they're probably at the Kilns again. Jack writes to Chad Walsh, who is the author of the very first biography of Lewis from, I think, 1947, called Apostle to the Skeptics. He was a professor of English at Beloit College in Beloit, Wisconsin, which my younger sister graduated from. Go figure. Not that that means that I have any greater credentials or authority because of that, but nevertheless, coincidence. October, Jack goes to London to take part in a debate, has tea with Joy Davidman and her parents at the Piccadilly Hotel. This is the picture of the Piccadilly. 54, Jack gives his inaugural lecture at Cambridge University. She attends. Jack celebrates his 56th birthday. And last spring, I talked about Jack's life. I don't expect you to remember everything about it. But he taught at Oxford University from 1925 to 1954, Cambridge University from 55 to 63. And lived in Oxford the entire time, took a train or had a driver drive him over to Cambridge on Monday morning to do his teaching and live in his rooms at Cambridge University. December, they spend 4 days at the Kilns. 55, Joy writes to her husband, indicates they've been discussing a book that eventually became Till We Have Faces, so she inspired that book. 1955, she published this book, Jewish Background, Jewish Parents. She wrote this interpretation of the Ten Commandments. And she's the author. Lewis wrote the foreword. Look whose name is in bigger letters on the cover. I think maybe the publisher was thinking that might help sell the book. Of course it did. She and her sons rent a house, a place in Headington, which is a mile from the Kilns, after living in London for almost 2 years. Jack goes to visit Arthur Greaves, mentions to Arthur that Joy Gresham has been denied permission to stay in England because she's outstayed her visa, and so she's got to go back to the States. 1955, the release of Jack's autobiography, Surprised by Joy, up to and including his conversion to theism. 1956, he marries Joy in a civil ceremony at the Oxford Registry Office in Oxford. They don't live together. He basically, you know, that previous slide that she's been denied, she has to go back to the States. She wants to stay in England. It's less expensive there, which probably is a bit of a switch today. But they simply tied the knot and they continued living as they were. And basically he says, I extended my British citizenship to her, but nothing else will change. Did her a favor. She didn't want to go back. And later that month, he tells Roger Green about his marriage as a matter of friendship and expediency. Roger Green was a kind of a baron, inherited an estate somewhere in England, was a writer of children's stories of some note and a good literary scholar, former student of Jack Lewis, and Jack would often have Roger read things he was writing, especially the Chronicles of Narnia, and Roger Green he was ecstatic about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I think he's the first guy who ever read it, except maybe the Inklings, in one of the Inklings meetings, that it was read to them. 1956, this evening, Catherine Farrer falls after calling, well, not Catherine. Catherine calls Joy Davidman, whose left femur breaks as she goes to answer the telephone. I'm going to show you a video clip of 4.5 minutes from the movie Shadowlands, the version that was made for the television, which we'll get into the 3 different versions of Shadowlands. But the 4.5 minute clip that I'm going to show you is right after she breaks her femur. She's taken to the hospital, and Jack is hearing the diagnosis from the physician, and he visits Joy in the hospital, and for the first time shows some affection for her, let's say. Anyway, it's an interesting spot in the movie. She has 3 operations in November. She's very seriously ill. Jack doesn't think she's going to get out of the hospital. She'll die there. And he wants to marry her in the eyes of the church. He didn't think much of the civil ceremony. It was just allow her to stay in England. But now that he's about to lose her, he realizes that he loves her. And so meets the Bishop of Oxford, Reverend Harry Carpenter to ask if he would permit one of the Anglican priests to marry Jack and Joy. He's talking to a guy named, an Anglican priest named Harry, but it's not this guy in the movie, because the Anglican priest says that the bishop would not allow it. So obviously the Harry, that an actor in that part of the movie, is not the Bishop of Oxford. He wouldn't talk about the bishop not allowing it. December, Times prints the announcement of Jack's marriage to Joy Gresham, excuse me. So this is still, they're married in the eyes of the court. In 1957, March 21, Jack marries Joy at an ecclesiastical ceremony at the Wingfield Hospital. Peter Bide, Anglican priest, presides. So I like to say, you know, Joy Davidman is the woman that Jack married twice. And people are a little bit puzzled by that, but yeah, they weren't married, then divorced, and then remarried, but he married her before the eyes of the state and then before the eyes of God. In April, she moves to the Kilns. Bill Gresham, her now divorced husband, writes to Joy stating that he would want the boys to live with him in the event of her death. And 4 days later, Jack writes 2 forceful letters to William Gresham saying that the boys remember you as the father who was drunk, who once broke a bottle over Douglas's head, who broke chairs, who came home late, who, you know, the bad memories. And Jack writes and says, you know, if you persist in this effort, I will put every legal obstacle in your way that I possibly can. And don't you want to leave the boys with a good memory of their father rather than what's likely to happen if you try to become the guardian of the boys? I mean, he could probably get it done legally, but would have really ruptured his relationship to his sons. So he marries Joy in this ecclesiastical ceremony. There's the Wingfield. She moves to the Kilns. Yeah, I repeated this, I guess. So sorry about that. Joy seems to be recovering. Jack's pain is less. She's bedridden at the Kilns sitting room. And in July of 57, so they got married in, what was it, March? 4 months later, he writes stating that Joy's cancer is arrested. He now recognizes that he had osteoporosis rather than a slipped disc, and he theorizes in some of his letters that maybe as she was gaining strength in her bones, it was because he was losing strength in his bones, like there was this transference from him to her. Probably not the case, but coincidental. Joy is able to walk again by that December. Official diagnosis that the cancer is arrested. They spend a honeymoon at a country hotel. And in July of 58, they fly to Ireland for 2 weeks, enjoying, it looks like a painting, but I think it's actually a photo, the beauty of counties Louth, Down, and Donegal. Joy accompanies Jack back to Cambridge in the afternoon, checks into the Lion Hotel. Tonight is the Pepys dinner, for which Jack is the speaker, giving the address, the panegyric. Today is the birthday of Samuel Pepys. The college that Lewis taught at in Cambridge had the entire library of Samuel Pepys, great British writer and diarist from the 17th century AD, donated to them. So you can see a lot of Samuel Pepys books in that library today, and Joy probably was there. Spent 3 weeks in Ireland again at the Old Inn. I'll show you a picture of the Old Inn in the next slide. And there's a little bit of a travelogue here. Not that I've ever been there, but I'm sure there are a few Lewis groupies that have tried to get to every place that Jack ever visited or stayed at. 1959, Jack and Joy died with T.S. Eliot and his wife. You might know, if you know names of any English poets, 20th century poet T.S. Eliot. Jack and Eliot were on a commission together to revise the Book of Psalms for the Church of England worship book. In October, he writes to Mary Shelburne, sort of a pen pal of his, he wrote over 100 letters to her, a U.S. citizen from the Baltimore area and later Washington, D.C., I think. So it indicates that her cancer is returned. Joy writes to her former husband. She's losing ground. April, Jack and Joy visit in Greece with Roger Green and his wife June, visit Athens, Rhodes, Crete. So Jack is not lecturing during the Easter term, so he can travel. He's never been to Greece, a place that both of them had read about in a lot of great classic writings, and they were classicists in some ways. They had read Plato and Aristotle and the playwrights. I'm drawing a blank on Euripides, for instance, and Sophocles. May 20, 1960, surgery again for Joy. June, Jack tells Warren that he was up all night with Joy. So the cancer is it's near the end of Joy's life. Joy tells her friend Hibby this is the end. She goes to the hospital. Douglas brought home from school. July 11th, she seems much better. People who are near death sometimes rally a day or two or three before their eventual death. And then on July 13, she dies. Warren is awakened by Joy's screaming. Jack calls the doctor. They take her to the Radcliffe. She dies at 10:15 that night. And on July 18, they have her funeral at the chapel of the Oxford Crematorium. That's a picture I took from the Oxford Crematorium. And that's basically the story of the relationship between the two that is told in the movie, the stage play, Shadowlands. And so now we get into Shadowlands. What is that story? And what's its biblical basis? So there's a Norman Stone film for Thames Television. There is a stage play. And then there's the Brian Eastman film version. All three of them are based on a book by Brian Sibley, a biography of Lewis. Pretty decent book. I own it. I've read it. And so based on that biography, these three versions of Shadowlands were produced. A little bit more detail about those three. So the BBC television had a script revised by William Nicholson. Brian Sibley wrote the script. It was aired in '85. And Joss Ackland is Lewis. Claire Bloom is Joy Davidman. I think I'd heard the name Claire Bloom before I saw this movie. I'd never heard of Joss Ackland, but this is the version from which I've got a 4.5-minute clip to show you in just a bit. Stage play aired first at Royal Theatre Royal in Plymouth, England on October 5, '89, and London Broadway. It ran there, ran for a couple of years. And some of the actors and actresses, again, William Nicholson was the writer, kind of an agnostic, but that explains why some aspects of the film or the or the stage play are not quite adequate, quite true to life. And the cinematic film, directed by Sir Richard Attenborough, who I guess is a famous name in British movie making, right? Okay. Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger are Jack and Joy. And again, William Nicholson gets his hand in the script. So most people have heard of Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. And Deborah Winger gets high marks for her acting. Anthony Hopkins, not so much. So this is the cover of the DVD that I own. It's back in Austin, Texas, and it's the version of the movie we tried to get. We ordered it from a library. We're thinking maybe we'd show it to you tonight, and then we realized, okay, showing it here would make it difficult for people online, so I do commend the movie to you, and I'll give you a taste of it. This is the Theatre Royal in Plymouth, England, where the stage play first debuted, and it's a pretty big theater. Kind of amazing. So I'm about to show you, the next slide is the video clip, and Alex helped me with this, Anna Yang did too. It starts out kind of choppy, but it smooths out in a little bit. So once again, she just fell trying to answer the phone from a phone call from a friend of hers. Her left femur snapped, and she's in the hospital. And Jack comes in to talk to the doctor and find out what's going on. And then we see Joy in her bed, and hospital bed, and Jack talks to her. And so let's see if we can get the sound adequate and the audio. So this is the telephone that I guess that rang. See if I can get this started. Oh, I know it. Yeah. There.
How can a person be fit and active and lead a full and vigorous life 1 minute and then...
There had been some pain before.
Well, everybody has pain somewhere.
That's how it often goes, I'm afraid. Sudden lurches.
Sudden lurches. Dear God. How much has she been told?
She's been told that the cancer has eaten away her left femur, that she has a malignant tumor in one breast. She knows that it's serious. How could she not know? Her hip bone snapped like a frozen twig.
Nobody seems to know what's going on. So, they're going to operate on the broken hip tomorrow. It's not too good.
Dear Mr. Lewis, I'm a Jew, divorced, broke, and I have cancer. My question is, do I get a discount?
How's the pain?
Kind of pushy.
Well, don't talk if it hurts. Can you do that later, please, nurse?
I've given you 15 minutes already.
For pity's sake, woman, this is my wife! She wasn't the guilty party in the divorce. Her husband committed adultery with another woman, with several other women. He was violent. He hit the children.
It doesn't make any difference who's the guilty party. You know that as well as I do.
Harry, she's dying.
I'd marry her this lunchtime if it was up to me.
Look, a number of things have come clear to me in the past few days, Harry. This is not a sudden whim. You know how seriously I take the sacrament of Christian marriage. As it happens, Joy and I are already married in law. To me, that means nothing. I want to marry her before God.
I really am sorry, Jack. I just can't do it. The bishop would never give his consent.
I'm going to marry her, Harry. I'm going to marry you, Joy. I'm going to marry you before God and the world.
You don't have to, Jack.
I want to. It is what I want.
Make an honest woman of me.
Oh, no, it's me that's been dishonest. Look what it takes to make me see the truth.
Did I ever do it?
Don't leave me, Joy.
Jack, about marrying.
I'll find a way, I promise.
Back home, we have a quaint old custom. When the guy wants to marry the girl, he asks her. It's called proposing.
It's the same here.
Did I miss it?
Oh, Joy. Will you marry this foolish, frightened old man who needs you more than he can bear to say, and who loves you even though he hardly knows how?
Okay. Just this once.
Okay, so whet your appetites. If you've not seen the movie previously, you may want to see it. We're going to talk about the movie, that version, the Joss Ackland and Claire Bloom movie. Like I said, there are 3 different versions of it, 2 for the theater and 1 for the stage. This is the one that most people talk about when they talk about Shadowlands, because Anthony Hopkins is famous in the UK. He's been criticized Hopkins has, for Deborah Winger played Joy Davidman. Anthony Hopkins played Anthony Hopkins doing C.S. Lewis. So it was the personality of Lewis is pretty realistic in the film clip that you saw. He was a forceful, confident, intellectually brilliant academic, and Hopkins comes across as kind of shy and retiring, and a good actor, I guess a great reputation, but just not really a convincing C.S. Lewis for my money. Anyway, let's talk about the term Shadowlands, what is meant by the term. And if I can, I'll borrow a passage from the last battle, the 7th Chronicle of Narnia, to explain a little bit, also illustrating the fact that Plato's idea of forms, that for everything that exists here on this earth, there is an ideal version of that. In heaven we see physical trees, but there is a perfect tree in the next life. We see human beings that are imperfect. In the next life, they're perfect. Not all that far from a lot of what Christians think based on Romans 8:18. But this is the passage from the conclusion of the book, The Last Battle. There was a real accident, said Aslan softly. Your father and mother and all of you are, as you used to call it in the Shadowlands, dead. So the 4 children and their parents have died in a railroad accident, and now they are in heaven, or Narnia, I guess you could say. The term is over, the holidays have begun, the dream is ended, this is the morning. And as he spoke, he no longer looked to them like a lion, but the things that began to happen after that were so great and beautiful that I cannot write them. And for us, this is the end of all the stories, and we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. So Lewis is reflecting the concept of Shadowlands in these concluding 2 paragraphs of The Last Battle, which is the 7th and last Chronicle of Narnia. So I cited Romans 8:18 previously to you. This sometimes is really hard for a pastor or anybody to say to a friend who has cancer like Joy Davidman is, or going through tremendous suffering or anguish. But this is a promise that we have from Scriptures. And even when it doesn't seem like that, we step out by faith to believe that these words are true, and they bring us some comfort. In The Weight of Glory, Lewis says something similar, like a Shadowlands-like statement. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. So we are in the Shadowlands, and our desires, our experiences will be far greater in the next life. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what that is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. He's giving this talk to a bunch of university students in Oxford in 1941. Remember, if you were with us for the Spring Quest course, I talked about The Weight of Glory, which is the famous essay/sermon from which these couple paragraphs are excerpted. So the King Arthur story for Lewis was part of his reading pleasure back in his younger days that contrasted the real England from the current version of England. He talks about there being a real France, and then there's the current version of France. I mean, the real France is the great France, the one that is the reality, whereas the current France is the Shadowlands. And he also talks about Logos in England. Logos is the ideal England, the greater reality of England versus the England that he was living in at that time. And I already told you a little bit about the Ransom trilogy, where some of King Arthur's legend and the literature of those stories comes into the Ransom trilogy, because in that hideous strength, there is a character that comes into that hideous strength out of the King Arthur stories. Anybody know the name? The name of the character from the King Arthur stories that shows up in that hideous strength? Merlin. Yeah, thank you. So Merlin the magician, who is part of the story. Hopefully that intrigues you a little bit to maybe think, I might give that book a try. I don't know. So a warning that hideous strength is longer than the first two books in the trilogy combined. So it's a lengthy book, but again, it connects to the abolition of man, helps us to understand the abolition of man better. By the way, I didn't say this in the first hour, but there is an essay called The Poison of Subjectivism that could be described as a summary of the abolition of man. So if anybody's kind of intrigued, never read The Abolition of Man, but they don't think they want to try it, if it's as forbidding as Heck described it, just send me an email and I will, I'll send you an electronic version of The Poison of Subjectivism. It's probably, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000 words long, and as opposed to the book, it's less than 1/10 the length of the book, and does hit all the major issues that Lewis addresses in The Abolition of Man. So sort of a Cliff Notes version of The Abolition of Man. And if you really like it and maybe even understand it, you might want to graduate from there to The Abolition of Man subsequently. But I digress. You've heard of this letter, I think. In Hebrews 8, verse 5, it talks about the priests who serve at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. Chapter 9, for Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself, now to appear for us in God's presence. So there's some biblical passages, Romans 8:18, Hebrews 8 and 9, that offer us the reality. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, from 1 Corinthians 15. So Lewis isn't just pulling this out of the air or from English literature. He's drawing on the scriptures as well when he talks about Shadowlands, even though in his own impressive style, he's able to give it a term, a title that captures our imagination. Shadowlands, I just love that word. That's a great word to describe what's being discussed here in the letter to the Hebrews. So a little bit about the movie. There are some factual inaccuracies. Yeah, Joy fell when answering a telephone call from Kathleen Farrer, the wife of one of the chaplains at Oxford University, not from C.S. Lewis as it is in the movie. Sorry about that. Joy was treated in a hospital in Oxford, not London. She had two sons, not one. The Attenborough version with Anthony Hopkins has only one son. Of course, David Gresham is the main one. I understand did you read that recently, that he's in hospice care? Anyway, he's near the end of his life. And that's Douglas. I mean, David has died some years back, but Douglas, stepson of C.S. Lewis, is in his mid-70s, which, to my way of thinking, he's just a spring chicken yet, but yeah. So Douglas was 8 when he met Jack Lewis, 15 when his mother died. And this is where they met, as I said earlier, but on the left. But the film, when they meet at the hotel, they film it at the Randolph Hotel on the right, even though it was the Eastgate Hotel. And if you went inside both hotels, you'd know why. The Eastgate Hotel has a ceiling that's lower than this one. The Randolph Hotel has a dining room that's vast with a ceiling that's probably 25 feet high and a great location for filming as opposed to the Eastgate Hotel. I forgive them for that one. Some major problems, got some strengths and weaknesses to the movie. I still encourage you to see it. And by the way, yeah, we ordered the DVD, and so you'll have a better quality picture than we saw. But the entire movie is on YouTube, free of charge. You can watch it on YouTube, and the entire, I guess, the full-length version is about 130 minutes. So you can watch it if you can put up with slightly fuzzy images for many of the scenes. It's filmed on in Oxford, at Oxford University, with a lot of, what we saw was the chapel of Magdalen College where Lewis taught, saw the tower of Magdalen College, and we saw, I guess we didn't see the hotel, but, so they're authentic Oxford sites that make their way into both the TV version and the cinematic version of the movies. So yeah, the movie, in spite of the fact that an agnostic toyed with the script, moved people to reconsider the Christian faith. The whole meaning of Shadowlands is a powerful meaning as people think about what that means. There is a strong faith element in the BBC version, and that's, we're talking about Joss Ackland and Deborah Winger. It is a great love story. I think Walter Hooper told me once that he never met a married couple that he thought was more deeply in love than Jack and Joy. It was just a truly Christian marriage, and they were deeply in love. And Walter knew Jack, didn't know Joy, never met Joy. She had died before Walter met Lewis. Lewis appears to lose his faith in the Attenborough version. He says it doesn't work. Remember that quotation? That's a weakness. That's not quite the case. Character of Joy isn't, it's pretty good, but much better Joy Davidman in the version made for the theaters. And some of the things that Bill Nicholson put in there are accurate and true, but somebody said that Bill Nicholson imagined the rest. Platitudes on pain, on inferior audiences that Lewis spoke to. But shift gears to one of Lewis's lesser-known books, The Four Loves. And this really describes, it came out in 1960, Joy died in 1960, and this is describing Lewis, even though he didn't like books to be read as descriptions of the author's thinking. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly be broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation. The only place outside heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell. And this is actually good pastoral ministry, both in the narrow sense of the word, how pastors can minister to the bereaved, but also pastoral in the sense any Christian can talk. Pain that a Christian feels at the loss of a loved one that meant a lot to them is directly connected to the love that they had prior to that. And if you are in a relationship that's very distant and that person dies, you are not impacted so much. But if you and that other person, could be a spouse, could be a sibling, are close and love one another in a genuine way, then to lose that person is going to be a lot more painful. But the grief is part of the picture of a love relationship. And I hope you would say, I don't want this kind of keeping everything intact, giving my heart to no one, wrapping myself up in a casket and not taking any risks in a relationship. So that kind of comes with the territory, I guess you could say. But in a certain sense, if I am grieving hard, is that a way to say it? It's a reflection of the precious treasure I had for the years prior that has set me up for this pain now. And it can, I can give thanks to God in a certain sense for the level of grief I'm experiencing when a parent or a grandparent or a friend dies, because if that person didn't mean anything to me, I wouldn't be grieving now. So there's some real ministry that the Spirit does through that realization. Some more strengths and weaknesses. Stage play, success story, the most powerful version, I think. Many look beyond the films to Lewis's writings and read him, captured the popular imagination. Weaknesses, Nicholson writes about a guilt-ridden C.S. Lewis, an insulated C.S. Lewis, an emotionally aloof man learning to get in touch with his feelings, which wasn't Lewis. I'll illustrate that in a moment. Shows Lewis dressing well, driving, Joy having one son. Lewis did not dress well. Somebody once said that Lewis had the unique ability to make a suit look old and worn on the second wearing of it. He once was walking in Addison's Walk at Magdalen College, and it's kind of a triangle, that's pathway, and it was late at night, I think it was in the autumn, and went around the path a couple of times, and once he looked to the side and he saw a hat on a bush. He said, that looks like my hat. And he took a closer look and he said, it is my hat. And it was a soggy mess, and he put it on his head and he kept on walking. So this is the guy, this is also the guy who thought that putting your cigarette or pipe ashes on the carpet was good for the carpet. Anyway, and he did not dress well. He did not drive. He drove early in life, but he took a taxi, took a train. He had people drive him places, so he gave up driving in his early adulthood. And yeah, Joy did have 2 sons. Doug Grisham was positive about the movie, strong emotional content. Deborah Winger, who visited, this is the version we're talking about now with Joss Ackland. She visited the Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois, to do research on Joy Davidman in order to portray her accurately. And Philippians 1:15 is a passage relative to this. I won't go there, but I have a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. I think that's part of that passage. Christ is not central in the movie like he was in Lewis's life. Hopkins was being himself rather than playing Lewis. The idea that romantic love here and now is our whole concern. The movie, that Lewis and Joy were both better than that. And this shy introvert that Anthony Hopkins portrayed. Let me give you an example from a piece of writing that Lewis wrote to a poet, a woman by the name of Ruth Pitter. And he read some of her poetry from a new volume of poetry that she had just had published. And he writes to her, he's read some of her stuff. He writes to her, "Bright angel, I'm in a sea of glory. I wonder how you yourself have any notion how good some of these are. But as you see, I'm drunk on them at this present. Glory be. Blessings on you, as sweet as sin and as innocent as milk. Thanks forever. Yours in great excitement, Jack." Written by someone shy and introverted. I think there's a weakness there in that portrayal. Strengths, artistic integrity, follows the main outline of the story. Weaknesses, George Sayer, who wrote one of the best biographies, his name is in the handout for this last hour, says he never recognized Hopkins' portrayal of the Lewis he knew. Sayer knew Lewis. He was a student of Lewis and then later on an English professor at Malvern College. And Lewis was a guest in his home, and Sayer a guest in Lewis's home, so he knew Lewis extremely well. Father Bide's prayer for Joy's healing is skipped in the Attenborough version. So let's go to that Philippians 1 passage where Paul says, "It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice." The story of Lewis and his love of God and of joy and the power of his life and his writings is promoted through this movie, and the passage doesn't fit perfectly because Attenborough and Nicholson weren't preaching Christ, but nevertheless we can rejoice because the message of the film has led people to the Christian faith, has led them to the writings of Lewis and to Scripture. And I think this is my last slide. You've got this information on the handout. The first one we talked about, best biography, at least some would say. There are others that prefer other biographies to this one. Best biography of Joy Davidman, originally in God Came In, and then revised a little bit to be issued as a Love Observed, a Grief Observed, a Love Observed, so kind of companion volumes. Lewis on Love, Douglas Gresham's perspective, really well-written book. And then a couple of books about Joy Davidman, if you're interested in that at all. Patty Callahan is the author of a book I'm reading right now called Once Upon a Wardrobe, which is a historical novel that takes a lot of the facts of Lewis's life from Oxford in about 1950 and weaves in an imaginative tale of a family that lives in Oxford, and a boy that's 8 years old and is very weak and mostly bedridden, and his sister goes to find out from C.S. Lewis where Narnia came from. And so I'm just early on in the book, but it seems to be kind of delightful, and I got it out of the Bethel Library, or Cheryl did for it. She found the book and lent it to me, and so I started reading it. So anyway, good book, and that's Patty Callahan who wrote that book, Out of the Wardrobe, or Once Upon a Wardrobe, as well as this book about Joy Davidman, which I think won some awards, but I haven't read it. I've read Abigail Stanton. I've read all of the books on this list except for Becoming Mrs. Lewis. So anyway, time for a couple questions. We're about 5 minutes to 9. So Eddie, thoughts or comments? Anybody mad at Erica for winning the book?
How about you picking it?
Picking what?
Her name.
Oh, well, she got it. I mean, mad at me for picking her name out of the bowl. I guess we could do that too. So I hope you'll find the movie and watch it. Like I said, it's free on YouTube. Probably the other one is too, the Attenborough version for the theater. The Ackland and Claire Bloom version is for television, and the later one is for the theater.
What year was the television one?
I think the one that I talked about mostly, Ackland and Bloom or Winger, was 1985. And then I think the stage play, it's in by PowerPoint. Let me just go back to that slide. Here we go. So 85, 89, and 93. So stage play is the middle one. Okay. Any other thoughts? Questions? Comments? We'll close with a prayer if there aren't any, and you can.
For all that you have shared with us. You have gleaned so much over the years. Appreciate it.
It's been a labor of love. I'm not quite what Walter Hooper was, the private secretary to Lewis in the last year of his life. He called himself a single subject lunatic. And it was all about Lewis. So some people have accused me of that, but remember, I don't worship Lewis. I worship Jesus. And I appreciate Lewis because he points people to Jesus. But just as a way of proving that I don't worship Lewis, I'm going to do one more quest course next spring on things I've learned about the Old Testament from 40 years of teaching the Old Testament. So I'm going to grab some of the stuff I think is the best PowerPoints, the best lectures, the best things, the most helpful things that I've learned, and put them together into a 4-week quest course. And that'll be 3 out of 4 quest courses during the 2 years I'm here. And maybe that's why the numbers are dwindling with each successive quest course. But we'll do it one more time, and let's close with the prayer, shall we? Lord God, ultimately, this is really a chance to lift up our Savior, Jesus Christ, and to point people to you, to heaven, to the characters that have crossed our paths in their books and their lives, their stories' lives. Thank you for the intersection with our lives that Lewis has had, especially during these 4 weeks, but before and perhaps after as well. We pray that your kingdom will come in people's lives as a result of the things that we're able to share in our conversations, in our witness, in our speaking, our teaching, our preaching, whatever role that we have as a communicator of truth. May it be Spirit-inspired and blessed by his presence to point people to the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, even Jesus Christ, our risen Savior. We pray in his name. Amen. Okay.